And in this week's episode, oil tankers, where the bloody hell are you? Houthis, we were waiting for you, baby, we knew you were coming. And ground operations in Iran, because Pete Hogsbreath just loves blowing shit up and killing things. All this and more on this week's Friday News Review. Okay, welcome to the program. Recorded a little bit late. It's actually Monday the 30th of March for this Friday News Review, but I'm overseas in Indonesia at the moment, so schedules are a little bit up and down. I'm about as organised as the United States military at the moment. So what I thought I'd do just for this week's program is just have a very quick look at, shall we say, the stars of the show, the main players in the region. So we're going to start with these guys, Saudi Arabia. Essentially, Saudi Arabia was proclaimed by King Abdulaziz in 1932, and it was at the behest, the machinations of the British. They had their fingers all over this because they were trying to unite the Arab tribes, as we know, against the Ottoman Empire and to extend their influence in the region. Then in 1938, voila, vast oil reserves were found along the coast of Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia suddenly became a very influential and important country. We had Aramco, the big American organization, go in and start drilling for oil. Aramco's since been bought out by the Saudis. They actually own Aramco now. They actually own their own oil sources. What is Saudi Arabia? It is a Islamic fundamentalist state. It's funny, we're always talking about Iran in those terms. That's exactly what Saudi Arabia is, only it's worse. They're Wahhabists, so they are repressive. It operates under a monarchy, which is essentially a dictatorship. The Saudi royal family, the House of Saud, fills all of the major posts in government, including being in charge of press freedom, the courts. Everything is run by one interconnected family. In an index of freedoms, Saudi Arabia was rated 8 points out of a possible 100 in terms of its individual freedoms and liberties. It is a repressive society with public beheadings of criminals who go through a court system with no right of appeal that is heavily influenced, if not entirely controlled, by the monarchy. And in fact, in 2010, Hillary Clinton, our good friend Hillary, she came out and she declared that Saudi Arabia is the largest sponsor of ISIS and state terrorism in the region. So that's an interesting point which never gets brought up in our mainstream media. In terms of the American presence there, we have the Prince Sultan Air Base. That's a huge air base. Generally in peacetime, it doesn't have a massive military presence. About 3,000 US personnel are stationed there. I think that's going to be changing at the moment. It's probably reducing at the moment. And that is the major air base for the US in that part of the region. So claims that Saudi Arabia has nothing to do with any of these attacks on Iraq and that they're innocent. Why is Iraq targeting Iran? See, I keep mixing them up. Iran, why is Iran targeting us? They were heavily involved in the attacks on Iraq, by the way. Saudi Arabia allowed the US to base its forces all over the country. One of the reasons why a little guy called Osama bin Laden got pretty upset. So Saudis have got their finger all over this war in Iran. They are complicit, make no mistake about that, and they are an active participant in combat operations against Iran by allowing the Americans to use their facilities, to use their infrastructure and the strategic base for missions against Iran. Basically, let's cut to the chase. Saudi Arabia, not a really nice bunch of people, not a great place. Moving on. So, moving off the coast of Saudi Arabia, we have Qatar. Basically a tin pot little island just abutting Saudi Arabia. Now, between 1916 and 1971, Qatar was a British protectorate. Our friends from the UK got their fingers all over the Gulf, haven't they? Because, again, in 1940, vast reserves of hydrocarbons were discovered in the area in Qatar. What the British have done is consistently installed repressive families to rule as dictators over the populace of the Gulf states, so that the West can have access, influence and control of the vast energy reserves stored in the region. Nothing to do with improving the life of people. Although the local people, if you're in the right side, you do really well, because all of these states have things like free healthcare, no tax, because they rely on their vast energy reserves to make obscene amounts of money. Speaking of the people of Qatar, there are only 313,000 Qatari citizens. 2.5 million people that live there are residents, non-citizen residents. Just like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has the largest non-citizen resident population in the world, by the way. 40% of the Saudi population are resident non-citizens. Why is this happening with these states? Because these Gulf states, what they do is they import people as a resource. Now, at the top end, the high echelon, they get the businessmen and women to come in, doctors, specialists, all sorts of high-end professionals who are exceedingly well paid to run businesses, run hospitals, schools, etc. But the vast majority of this migrant workforce that inhabits these countries are poor, underprivileged people from countries like this where I'm staying at the moment, Indonesia or the Philippines, and these people are brought in essentially as slave labour. They work under appalling conditions. Many have their passports taken and confiscated. Now just think of that. That would be illegal in any Western country. The conditions they work under, I mean, as I've said before in previous episodes this year, ain't no unions in the Middle East. These people work like slaves and they are subjugated by repressive regimes. Now, officially, Qatar is a constitutional monarchy. But the constitution basically puts all of the power in the monarch's hands. They did have a brief flirt with democracy between 2021 and 2024 when they allowed elections for some of their legislature, only some, not all. But in 2024 they decided that they didn't really like having people decide who should rule them, and the royal family took over control again. So that was their their brief flutter with democracy. Once again, something that is never ever mentioned on mainstream Western media, and the finger is always pointed at Iran, and we're talking about democracy. Well, Iran is one of very many states in the region that doesn't operate a democratic system the way we see it. But ironically, Iran is far more democratic than you think, and we'll come to that. So Qatar is basically another repressive state with police surveillance. Not a nice place to be. And just like Saudi Arabia, these countries are going to suffer severely now because their tourism industry is going to collapse. And one wonders that if the workers can get their passports back, how many of them will be fleeing the area and basically leaving these fat, lazy people who have relied on essentially slave labour to do all the hard work. How are they going to run their countries without all their poor folk down below? Bahrain, another little tin pot island, once again off the coast of Saudi Arabia. And once again, we're seeing a familiar pattern here. Heavily involved were the British in the 1860s until 1862. They signed a treaty, and Bahrain remained a British protectorate once again until 1971, when the royal family was installed as the sole rulers of the country. Bahrain operates with a so-called constitutional monarchy, but once again, the family that runs the country, the royal family, have the final say in all of the appointments. The legislature is over 50% are part of the same family. So, I mean, how can you have any semblance of democracy or freedoms in a country where one family basically represents the entire government? And it's not like a constitutional monarchy where there's a parliamentary authority which is democratically elected. That doesn't exist in these nations. They are authoritarian dictatorships in all but name. And in 2016, the European Parliament passed a resolution condemning Bahrain because of its repressive policies towards the Shia population. Now, Bahrain is about 1.5 million people. Once again, only 46% of the people in Bahrain are actually citizens. Like all Gulf countries, they rely massively on a transient workforce to come and do all the hard work for them. And Bahrain has the added difficulty that about 33% of their actual population, their residents, their citizens, are Shia. So they're highly supportive of Iran, which is a Shia Muslim state as well. So you might just find that Bahrain may be the first country in the region where America's regime change operation may actually be successful. Bahrain is repressive. It has a history of detaining, torturing, and killing what it refers to as agitators, basically anyone who criticizes the government, particularly the Shia population. Clerics and scholars are routinely rounded up and arrested for no reason and are tortured. Bahrain has an appalling human rights record. It is listed in the human rights indices as the least free country in the Middle East. That tells you a lot about the areas we're supporting. And of course, who is in Bahrain apart from the Bahrainis? The American Fifth Fleet has its base there, so which you would have seen recently getting blown up by Iran. So once again, for these countries to claim that they're anything but repressive dictatorial regimes is a lie, and for these countries to claim that they are not actively involved in supporting this illegal and unprovoked war on Iran is also a lie, because the war against Iran could not function without the US being able to access these facilities in all these neighboring countries. So Iran is being attacked from its neighboring countries. So they have every reasonable just cause to fire back at those countries and to specifically target the areas and the facilities and the infrastructure that is crucial to the ongoing American war effort. Wouldn't any country do the same? And moving on up the coast, we come to that lovely little, tiny little nation, Kuwait. In 1899, the British signed a treaty after lots of machinations. I won't go into the long, involved history beforehand, but Kuwait became a British protectorate. We're seeing a pattern here until 1961, when they gained their independence. Now, Kuwait is an emirate. They're run by an emir, because apparently there's no Arabic word for dictator anymore. The emir appoints, the government appoints all of the legislature positions in the country, appointed by one man. Understand, as I've said repeatedly, there are no democracies in the GCC states. So don't start with this argument about Iran and democracy. We are supporting states that are repressive, police-controlled regimes. They are authoritarian states with an appalling human rights record. And speaking of Kuwait's human rights record, in 1995 it was even raised in the House of Commons in London, because the Kuwaitis have a habit of withdrawing any legal documentation that confirms your statehood. They call them Bedouin, the stateless people. In 1995, it was estimated that 300,000 people had been made stateless in Kuwait, and these people were transported to camps near the border with Iraq, and they were left with insufficient food and water in what Amnesty International described as tantamount to ethnic cleansing. These people ended up moving across the border to Iraq, where they remain to this day. Now, there's less than 5 million people in Kuwait, 70% of which are not Kuwaitis. Once again, all of these Gulf states rely on massive influx of foreign people to do the work for them. These people are the labourers, the people that work, the servants, and there was quite some diplomatic tension between the Philippines and Kuwait over the treatment accorded to Filipino workers, many who are used as maids, and there are boundless cases of sexual abuse, violence against these women who have been persecuted. Once again, passports taken, basically put into ownership of rich households and treated like dogs. These are the people that we keep defending in the Persian Gulf. And the question begs, why? And next on the list we come to good old Iraq. Doesn't need much of an introduction, thanks to the Americans and their continual wars and destruction that they've perpetrated against that country. Iraq became independent in 1932 with the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and of course was briefly a British protectorate. Brits have got their hands all over this, haven't they? They've just fucked up the Gulf. This is what's caused a lot of the issues, is that Britain just arbitrarily drew lines on a map without any consideration or cognizance of the cultural and ideological differences in the region, and just decided that this area is now Iraq, this area is now Saudi Arabia, and put people in charge to rule over a whole lot of people who necessarily weren't very thrilled about the people in charge and the religious differences in the area, none of which Britain took into consideration when it made these arbitrary decisions. However, Iraq, currently a country of some 46 million people, and the history of Iraq and the Western involvement in Iraq is very, very sordid. We won't go into too much detail. I'm just trying to keep this brief just to give an overview. But the Americans basically goaded Saddam Hussein into attacking Iran and starting what was really the first Gulf War in 1980, which went to 1988. And during that time, we gave Iraq not only unlimited supplies of weapons, and we helped them, but we also ended up giving them the ingredients for chemical warfare agents. We made germ warfare happen, and we gave Saddam Hussein chemical warfare agents. Now, Donald Rumsfeld, we know, in 1987, travelled to Iraq to make sure that they had these weapons. Mainly, once again, because the Americans love to use other countries to test things and see how they work. And Iraq used chemical weapons against Iran, which refused to use them against Iraq, in a hideous war that took place there. Now, since that time, the Iraqis were subjugated to the Gulf Wars, as we call them, and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, mainly because he was going to start selling his country's oil and trading it in euros instead of the petrodollar. So Saddam Hussein, who had been one of our closest allies, the guy that we had backed to overthrow the monarchy and installed in the country in the first place, all of a sudden he had to go because he was going to undermine the mighty petrodollar and sell his oil in euros, which would have affected the strength of the greenback. And something we've talked about before, how the petrodollar is artificially inflating the greenback. So Saddam had to go. The fact that Iraqis were the subject of an appalling war, and as we know, sanctions afterwards, that bitch Madeleine Albright, and when she was told that the cost was 600,000 Iraqi children, think of it, over 500,000 Iraqi children perished because of America's actions and its subsequent sanctions. The United Nations words, not mine. And what did Madeleine Albright say? She thought that was a price worth paying, because they weren't your fucking kids, were they, Madeleine? Anyway, there's not much else to say about Iraq, except that at the moment, the resistance groups in Iraq are fighting the Americans, and as we've seen, they've been firing missiles and rockets into the American embassy. There is an awful lot of anti-American sentiment in Iraq, mainly because, as one Iraqi put it after the end of the Gulf War, under Saddam Hussein, things weren't great, but at least we had jobs, we had water, we had electricity. When the Americans came in, they destroyed all of those fundamental resources. Funny how they talk about that with Iran, war crimes, attacking things. The Americans blew up all of the water supply in Iraq. They destroyed the electricity grid, all of which undermined the civilian population's ability to survive. So there is a lot of resentment in Iraq. Iraq has appealed to the United Nations to have the Americans out of the country. They don't want the Americans there. But of course, the Americans have a habit of doing not what people want, not what's democratically or morally right, just what they think they need to do. Israel. Well. Look, the bottom line that Western media fails to acknowledge is that there is only one and one alone problem in the entire Middle East, and that problem is Israel. Pre-1948, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Christians all lived in harmony in the region. The Zionist state of Israel is not a nation state. It is a state built on racial supremacy, on suppression of others. It is an apartheid state. And as I've said often, the three main tenets of Zionism mirror the three tenets of Nazism exactly. You have God's chosen people, the master race. You have, we need a homeland and we need to take land and expand upon it. It's our God-given right. Lebensraum. And finally, we have the fact that we can take this homeland from the people around us because they are lesser people than us. They are not our equals. And in fact, many Zionists regard Palestinians and Arabs as mere animals. Untermenschen, anyone? So Israel is a cancer on the Middle East. It is a disgusting state. It has been aggressive. It has invaded and occupied part of every country, every nation that it borders. And it is now, even now, attempting to annex a larger part of southern Lebanon. And interestingly enough, once again, what the mainstream media won't show you is the Israelis are getting their asses kicked. There are credible reports that Hezbollah has destroyed over 100 of their Merkava tanks, each one costing $6 million each. Think about that if you're an American taxpayer. And disgracefully, the Lebanese government has refused to act to support Hezbollah, which it should do, because Hezbollah is defending the Lebanese state from an invasion by a neighboring state, which has continually invaded, harassed, and bombed its people. Right now, Israel is using white phosphorus and cluster bombs, both banned munitions, to attack apartment blocks in Beirut. What the hell has that got to do with the fighting on the front line? The Israelis, this time they're in trouble because we've got the Houthis from Yemen firing missiles now that they've come into the fray. And as we talked about in our last two episodes, that was only a matter of time. The Houthis were just biding their time. And now we've got Iran proving that despite all of America's technology and the billions of dollars poured into Israel militarily, there's no defense against these missiles that Iran is firing into Israel. And they are proving they can hit any target, even the area Dimona, which is near the Negev desert. And remember, we did an episode on Israel's illegal nuclear facility in the Negev desert. That would be one of the most heavily defended places on earth. And yet, Iranian missiles are able to fly through there with ease. So Israel, you won't see it because of the massive censorship that is being imposed. People are being threatened with up to 5 years in prison for filming what's going on there. But Israel is being hammered bit by bit. And we may be on the verge of seeing the end of the Israeli state because Israelis are fleeing by the bucket load. They're trying to get out. The airport is closed, but Israelis are trying to get out. And mark my words, if there is any kind of peace settlement in the near future, they'll be fleeing the sinking ship because just about every Israeli citizen is a dual citizen. They hold passports for other countries, predominantly the United States, but a lot of throughout Europe. And they'll be taking off. They'll be getting out of there. The land of milk and honey is suddenly not turning out to meet their expectations, mainly because, once again, as I say repeatedly, these people, and I'm talking about Zionists, remember, always make the distinction between Zionists and Jews. They're two different things. Judaism is a religion. Zionism is a political ideology based on supremacy. It's a colonial ideology. These Zionists have brought this upon themselves. Not only did they commit a live stream genocide in Gaza while the world disgustingly sat back and did nothing, but they went and they attacked Iran. This has been Benjamin Netanyahu's obsession, his pathological hatred of Iran for decades, and we've talked about this before. Finally, he found an American president weak enough and vain enough to allow it to happen. He tried it under Obama, he tried it under Biden. They stopped him. American presidents in the past went, no, don't go down that track, we won't support you. Trump, being the sap he is, walked right in to Netanyahu's trap and now has found himself and his nation stuck in a war that they want to get the hell out of and they don't know what to do. Same goes for Israel. Israelis are being hammered. They're about to get a lot worse. Iran has today announced that in response for the fact that Israel and America has been hitting apartment blocks in Iran and has killed over 2,000 people. Think of that, 2,000 people. Vast majority civilians. These are civilians that are being killed in Iran. They're now going to start hitting back at the homes and addresses of Israeli officials, and that means that residential areas will be hit. And once again, Israel has stepped up the pressure. Israel has brought that upon itself. And as we talked about many times, even last year, the danger of Israel going down, Israel being defeated. I've often said a defeated Israel is more dangerous than a victorious one, because there's every reason to assume that they will start using nuclear weapons as their final solution. And that is something that we really don't want to consider at all. And finally, we come to the star, the main attraction, Iran. Iran is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on earth. They can trace their continuity back to the 7th century BC. This is a country with a rich cultural history and a strong sense of self-identity. This is the Persian Empire, remember. These people trace their roots back to antiquity. Now, the Iranians, everything you've been told about Iran is, I'm going to put it bluntly, a lie. All of this bullshit about its repressive regime. Iran actually has an elected parliament. Did you know that? Okay. Yes, the Ayatollah is the supreme leader and he has authority over a lot of the country, but the parliament makes the decisions in the day-to-day running of the country. And one thing about the Islamic Revolution was it was the first time in Iran's history that women got the vote. Yes, they only got the vote when the Ayatollahs came to power, these so-called repressive dictatorial figures who immediately allowed women to vote. And the history of Iran is one, again, of colonial interference. In 1953, there was a British and American coup because they wanted to control once again, the energy reserves. Iran has the second largest natural gas and third largest oil reserves on the planet. Aha! Now you know why we have to go to war with Iran, because we want to get our fingers on all of that energy. Now, in 1979, they actually held a referendum. I bet you didn't know this. They held a referendum on whether to retain a monarchy or to go to an Islamic republic. And an overwhelming majority, 93%, voted to go to an Islamic republic, whereupon the US were poised to intervene, which is why you had students grab the US embassy staff. That was a splinter group. It wasn't related to the Iranian leadership at all. but it was in fear that the Americans were going to try and overthrow the Islamic Revolution. You see, so once again, you're not being told the truth. Now, even to this day, Iran has elections. Pezeshkian, the current president, sorry, I'm getting tired. I've been recording this all day. He was elected in 2024 after the previous occupant died in a helicopter crash, you may remember, while he was visiting Turkey. He was elected to his position. Iran allows its populace to elect their government representatives. All these lies you've heard about this uprising and 30,000 people being killed, what a joke. Stoning of women, that happens, it's still legal under Qatari law, by the way. You can stone women to death in Qatar. Iran is a modern, progressive country, highly advanced. As I said before, 60% of the graduates of Iranian University are women. They're females. And I remember, I wish I could find it. You know, you should record these things. When you see them, you should put them aside in a file. In around about 2007, I think it was, the ABC's Australian program called Foreign Correspondent, which used to be a really good program that would show you what's happening in countries around the world, they went to Iran and they followed a lady, a married woman. She worked as a doctor. She was educated. She had a university degree. She had a career. She had a family. And she went to work every day, drove a car to work at a time when in Saudi Arabia, as a woman, you couldn't drive a car. And she was going and working as a doctor. Now, of course, the ABC won't show you that program now because they want to perpetrate the continual lie that Iran is somehow this evil, despotic regime. And I think, as we've shown, the despotic, evil regimes are indeed in the Persian Gulf, but they're on the other side of the Gulf from Iran. It's the ones across the water that we should be targeting and we should be talking about. Now, I called this episode Mission Impossible because ultimately, in closing, I just want to briefly talk about Operation Epic Failure by name and by nature. We don't know what the Americans are planning, mainly because I don't think they do either. But with the ground troops now coming into the region, and I was watching Larry Johnson earlier, and he was highlighting the fact that basically the entire United States Special Forces community has been airlifted into the region. And as I said before, they're believed to be mainly in Jordan and Israel at the moment. A bit hard to go anywhere closer, boys, because your bases have all been blown up. So looking ahead, what can we expect? And there's much speculation about attacks on, say, Karg Island. Now, we did an episode 5 this year was on Karg Island. Whether they will attack other islands, possibly. One thing, and it just occurred to me, and I don't know if they would get the intel for this, if they knew where Iran's fissile material was stored, they may attempt to go in, grab it, or at least some of it, and take it back to the US. And that might not be such a bad thing, because they may then say, well, that gives them an off-ramp. They can say, well, they've done what they needed to do. You know, they've stopped Iran getting a nuclear weapon, when we all know the truth is what they've done is given Iran every impetus to build a nuclear weapon. And today it was announced that Iran is reviewing its nuclear doctrine. In other words, after decades of being adamantly opposed to ever having nuclear weapons, we went, ostensibly to stop them getting nuclear weapons, we went and killed the one person who refused to allow them to have nuclear weapons. Then we put into power a man whose father, wife, and child were killed in the same strike, and we expect him not to be thinking about having nuclear weapons as a deterrent to not being attacked like this again. Where this ends up, it's hard to say, and exactly what the military options will be are very unknown, but it's clear that they're looking at hit-and-run raids. As military analysts who know far more than I do have made clear, special forces aren't good for large invasions and holding ground. They're hit-and-run forces. They go in, they're given an objective, they take an area, they do something, they get out. that would appear to be what they're looking at, the Americans, whether they're planning to hit coastal batteries with the special forces to basically nullify all of Iran's firepower on the Strait of Hormuz so that they can open it again. But once again, with long-range missiles, that appears to be an unrealistic target. So nobody really knows what's going through the mind of Pete Hogsbreath. I don't think much goes through Pete's mind except praying for death and destruction. Clearly, the Americans have got themselves into a hideous bind because they're desperate to open the Strait of Hormuz because the world's economies are collapsing. And mark my words, this collapse will go on for the rest of the year, if not longer. The damage that has been done, and as we know, when America tries to commit itself to any kind of ground incursion, any kind of, as they say, boots on the ground, Iran is going to strike back vehemently, and it is going to destroy much of the energy infrastructure in the Gulf area, which means even if the solution is found to this conflict in the short term, and I think it will go on for months, the rebuilding of that infrastructure will take months and months, let alone before any supply can be resumed. So buckle up, people. Be prepared for the fact that your economies are going to suffer. Your oil price is only going one way, and it's never going to come back down to what it was. Don't ever think that oil is ever going to come back down to the $71 a barrel it was before all this started. We'll be lucky if oil is ever below 90 barrels in history ever again. So, as I've said before, well done BYD. Good time to buy a Chinese electric vehicle. This is Bintang Bernie saying we don't know what's ahead, except that every objective that the Americans have set themselves seems to be impossible to achieve and appears like it's only going to end in disaster. And as usual, we're all going to pay the price because of one man's evil, nasty obsession. And that is Benjamin Netanyahu. And although Trump is the public face of this and his American cohort of morons who have allowed themselves to be walked into this, they deserve all the criticism. But don't forget, the person who's making your groceries more expensive, the man who's making you pay more at the petrol pump, is none other than Benjamin Netanyahu. That one man alone is ultimately responsible for this. He's the evil behind all of it. All right, this has been Bintang Bernie on that note saying, as usual, two types of people in the world. Make damn sure you avoid them both.
And if you don't like it, then leave. Or use your right to protest on the streets. Yeah, use your right, but don't imagine